The Mystery of the Harvest Festival, a Miss Marple mystery. Hi there, welcome back to Haunting Vales. Tonight's mystery begins in the quiet village of St. Mary Mead during one of its most beloved traditions, the annual Harvest Festival. The church is decorated with golden wheat, baskets of apples, and the warm laughter of villagers who gather to celebrate another successful season. But beneath the cheerful decorations and polite smiles, something feels strangely out of place. Miss Marple notices the tension almost immediately, a hurried whisper behind the church door, a glance quickly avoided, and a small incident that no one seems eager to explain. What begins as a simple village celebration soon reveals a darker undercurrent of secrets, grudges, and carefully hidden truths. Because sometimes, the most dangerous mysteries hide behind the most innocent traditions. And before the Harvest Festival comes to an end, Miss Marple suspects that someone in the village has far more to hide than they are willing to admit. Before we uncover the truth behind the Harvest Festival's most troubling secret, don't forget to subscribe for more haunting Miss Marple mysteries on Haunting Vales. Chapter 1: The mystery begins at the Harvest Festival. Autumn always arrived gently in the quiet village of St. Mary Mead. The fields surrounding the village turned golden, the air carried the faint scent of apples and dry leaves, and the villagers began preparing for the most beloved event of the year, the Harvest Festival. It was a tradition that brought everyone together. Farmers displayed their best crops, families baked pies and bread, and the church hall was decorated with baskets of wheat, pumpkins, and jars of homemade preserves. For the villagers, the Harvest Festival was a symbol of community, trust, and gratitude. Miss Jane Marple had attended the festival for many years. She sat near one of the long wooden tables that afternoon, knitting quietly and observing the cheerful scene around her. To most people she appeared to be simply an elderly woman enjoying the festivities. But Miss Marple had a sharp mind and a habit of noticing the small details that others ignored. The festival that year had been organized mainly by Arthur Bellamy, a man who had moved to St. Mary Mead not long ago but had quickly become popular. He was tall, confident, and spoke with a warm friendliness that made people feel comfortable around him. Arthur had donated money to the church and had volunteered to help organize several village events. Many villagers had come to admire him, and some even said he had brought new energy to the quiet community. Yet Miss Marple noticed something unusual about him that afternoon. Although Arthur Bellamy greeted people warmly and laughed with the visitors, his eyes kept scanning the crowd as if he expected someone to appear. There was a tightness in his expression that did not match the cheerful celebration around him. Not long after, another man arrived who seemed far less cheerful. Leonard Griggs, a local farmer who had lived in St. Mary Mead all his life, walked across the green with a serious expression. Leonard was known as a hard-working and honest man, but today he looked troubled. Instead of joining the stalls or greeting his neighbors, he went straight toward Arthur Bellamy. The two men spoke quietly near one of the tables. At first their voices were calm, but the tension between them was obvious even from a distance. Arthur's confident smile disappeared, and Leonard's expression grew firm and angry. Miss Marple could not hear their words, but she could see the meaning in their faces. Leonard was clearly accusing Arthur of something, and Arthur seemed eager to end the conversation quickly. After a short moment, Arthur forced a polite smile and gestured toward the festival crowd as if reminding Leonard that they were in public. Leonard stared at him for a moment longer before turning and walking away across the green. The argument had ended, but the tension remained in the air. As the afternoon continued, the festival appeared to return to normal. Children played games, villagers purchased raffle tickets, and the smell of fresh bread and cider filled the air. Music played softly near the stage that had been set up for speeches and announcements later in the evening. When the sun began to set, lanterns were lit around the village green, casting a warm glow over the gathering crowd. The villagers slowly gathered near the small stage where Arthur Bellamy was scheduled to give a short speech to thank everyone for supporting the harvest festival. Arthur stepped onto the stage with his usual confident posture. He thanked the farmers for their hard work and praised the community spirit of St. Mary Mead. The villagers listened politely while sipping warm cider that had been prepared for the celebration. Then something strange happened. Arthur Bellamy suddenly paused in the middle of his speech. For a moment he looked confused, as if he had forgotten what he was about to say. His hand tightened around the podium, and his face grew pale. The cheerful murmuring of the crowd slowly faded as people noticed that something was wrong. Arthur swayed slightly, trying to steady himself. A few villagers stepped forward in concern, thinking he might be feeling unwell. But before anyone could reach him, Arthur collapsed onto the stage. The crowd gasped in shock. Several people rushed forward while someone called for the village doctor, who had been attending the festival nearby. Within moments the doctor knelt beside Arthur and examined him carefully. The cheerful harvest festival had suddenly become silent. After a short and tense moment, the doctor slowly stood and looked at the crowd with a grave expression. Arthur Bellamy was dead. The joyful atmosphere of the festival disappeared instantly, replaced by confusion and fear. Many villagers struggled to believe what had just happened. Only minutes earlier Arthur had been standing confidently on the stage. At first the doctor believed Arthur might have suffered a sudden heart attack. But Miss Marple, watching quietly from the edge of the crowd, was not entirely convinced. Something about the moment felt wrong to her. Her eyes moved toward the stage where Arthur's glass of cider still stood beside the podium. Later that evening, the police arrived from the nearby town to investigate the sudden death. As they questioned witnesses, one detail quickly caught their attention. Just before beginning his speech, Arthur Bellamy had taken a sip from that very glass of cider. The police carefully collected the glass for examination. By the following morning the doctor delivered a surprising conclusion. Arthur Bellamy had not died from natural causes. He had been poisoned. The news shocked the entire village. A murder during the harvest festival was almost impossible to imagine. The peaceful traditions of St. Mary Mead had suddenly been shattered. Very quickly, suspicion began to spread. Several villagers mentioned the argument between Arthur Bellamy and Leonard Griggs earlier that day. When the police questioned Leonard, he admitted that the two men had indeed argued. But he refused to explain what the argument had been about. That refusal immediately made him look suspicious. By the afternoon, whispers had spread across the village that Leonard Griggs must have poisoned Arthur Bellamy during the festival. It seemed like the most obvious explanation. But Miss Marple quietly believed the truth was not so simple. Because she had noticed something that others had ignored. Arthur Bellamy had looked afraid long before he stepped onto that stage. And people who are afraid usually have a reason. Which meant that somewhere in the peaceful village of St. Mary Mead, someone had a motive for murder that went far deeper than a simple argument at a harvest festival. And Miss Marple intended to find out exactly what that motive was. Chapter 2: The Secrets Behind the Harvest Festival. The morning after the harvest festival felt strangely quiet in St. Mary Mead. Normally, the village would still be talking happily about the celebration, sharing leftover pies and laughing about the small competitions that had taken place the day before. But this time the mood was very different. Instead of cheerful conversations, people spoke in hushed voices. The sudden death of Arthur Bellamy had cast a heavy shadow over the village. Miss Marple spent the morning in her sitting room, reading the newspaper while the kettle warmed beside her. The official report confirmed what the villagers already suspected. The doctor had determined that Arthur Bellamy had died from poison placed in the cider he drank during his speech. The police were treating the death as murder. Naturally, most of the suspicion had already begun to focus on Leonard Griggs. The police had spoken with several villagers who had witnessed the argument between Leonard and Arthur earlier that day. To many people, it seemed like a clear motive. An angry confrontation followed by a sudden poisoning at the festival. The story appeared simple enough for people who wanted quick answers. But Miss Marple had lived long enough to know that village gossip often rushed to conclusions far too quickly. Later that afternoon, she decided to take a quiet walk through the village. The autumn air was cool, and the narrow lanes of St. Mary Mead were unusually empty. As she passed the small grocery shop, she noticed two women speaking in low voices near the doorway. Both women immediately stopped talking when they saw Miss Marple approaching. That reaction alone told her that the topic of conversation had been the murder. Miss Marple greeted them politely and continued down the lane until she reached the farm belonging to Leonard Griggs. The farmhouse stood at the edge of the village, surrounded by fields that were beginning to fade into the soft brown colors of late autumn. Leonard himself was standing near the gate, repairing a section of fencing. He looked tired. When he noticed Miss Marple approaching, he straightened and removed his hat politely. Leonard had always respected Miss Marple, and he knew she was not the type of person who asked questions without good reason. Miss Marple greeted him warmly and spoke with the gentle tone that often encouraged people to speak more freely. She mentioned the tragic events of the harvest festival and expressed her sympathy. Leonard listened quietly, but his expression remained troubled. It was clear that the situation was weighing heavily on him. After a moment, Miss Marple asked the question that had been on many people's minds. Why had he argued with Arthur Bellamy? Leonard hesitated. For a moment it seemed as though he might refuse to answer again. But then he sighed and looked across the fields as if deciding that keeping silent would only make matters worse. Leonard explained that Arthur Bellamy had approached several farmers in the village over the past few months with a proposal. Arthur claimed he had connections that could help local farms sell their produce to large distributors in the city. He promised higher profits and better opportunities for everyone involved. At first, many farmers were interested. But Leonard had grown suspicious. The agreements Arthur offered required the farmers to sign documents giving him control over certain financial decisions. Leonard had examined the paperwork carefully and realized that Arthur would gain far more from the arrangement than the farmers themselves. In fact, Leonard believed Arthur was trying to quietly gain control over several local farms. When Leonard confronted him about it earlier that day, Arthur had denied everything. But Leonard was certain that Arthur's plan was dishonest. Miss Marple listened carefully. The explanation certainly provided a reason for the argument. But something about the story still did not feel complete. She asked Leonard one more question. Did anyone else know about this arrangement? Leonard nodded slowly. Arthur had approached at least 3 other farmers in the village with the same proposal. Some had been considering it seriously. Others had refused. Miss Marple thanked Leonard for speaking with her and began walking back toward the village. As she walked, she considered the situation carefully. If Arthur Bellamy had been trying to manipulate the farmers for financial gain, then Leonard was not the only person who might have confronted him. And that meant Leonard might not be the only person with a reason to dislike Arthur Bellamy. Later that evening, Miss Marple visited the church hall where the harvest festival had taken place. The decorations were still partially in place, though most of the stalls had been removed. She quietly examined the stage area where Arthur had collapsed. The table where the cider had been placed was still there. Miss Marple noticed something that made her pause. The cider had been served from a large container placed near the back of the hall. Volunteers had filled glasses and carried them to the stage throughout the evening. which meant something very important. Anyone who had access to the cider or the glasses could have poisoned Arthur's drink. It did not require a dramatic confrontation or a public argument. It only required a brief moment when no one was paying attention. Miss Marple also remembered something else. Arthur Bellamy had looked nervous even before his speech began. That kind of nervousness suggested that Arthur himself might have been expecting trouble. The following day brought another interesting discovery. The police had searched Arthur Bellamy's house and found several financial records that supported Leonard's claims. Arthur had indeed been working on a plan to gain control of farmland through complicated agreements. But the records revealed something even more surprising. Arthur Bellamy had been under serious financial pressure. Large debts had begun to appear in his accounts over the past year. If his plan with the farmers had succeeded, he would have gained a great deal of money. But if the plan had failed, Arthur Bellamy could have faced ruin. Miss Marple considered this information very carefully. Money often created strong motives for crime. But it could also create fear. Arthur Bellamy might have cheated people. He might have deceived the farmers. But the truth was becoming clearer with each new detail. Arthur Bellamy had been surrounded by people who had reasons to distrust him. Which meant that the Harvest Festival murder was not as simple as the village believed. The poison in the cider had not been placed there by accident. Someone had chosen that moment carefully. Someone had wanted Arthur Bellamy to die in the middle of the Harvest Festival, in front of the entire village. And that meant the murder had been planned with far more thought than anyone had first imagined. But Miss Marple had already begun to see a pattern forming. And if she was correct, the real motive behind the Harvest Festival murder was about to become impossible to hide. Chapter 3: The Truth Behind the Harvest Festival. By the third day after the Harvest Festival, the quiet village of St. Mary Mead was filled with unease. The police investigation had continued steadily, but no clear answer had emerged. Leonard Griggs remained the primary suspect in the eyes of many villagers, yet the evidence against him was thin. The only thing truly connecting him to the crime was the argument he had with Arthur Bellamy earlier that day. Miss Marple, however, believed the truth was hiding somewhere else entirely. She had spent the past 2 days quietly speaking with several villagers who had been involved in organizing the Harvest Festival. None of them suspected that their casual conversations were slowly helping Miss Marple piece together the events of that evening. One particular detail continued to stand out. The cider that had been served during the festival had been prepared earlier that afternoon by a small group of volunteers in the church kitchen. Several large containers were filled and placed near the back of the hall, and volunteers had been responsible for pouring the cider into glasses throughout the evening. At first glance, that arrangement made the investigation difficult. Too many people had access to the cider. Anyone could have slipped poison into a single glass without being noticed. But Miss Marple had learned something else. Only one person had been responsible for placing the glass of cider on the podium before Arthur Bellamy began his speech. That person was Margaret Hill. Margaret Hill was the church secretary and one of the most respected women in the village. She had lived in St. Mary Mead for many years and was known for her calm, dependable nature. No one had considered her a suspect, and the police had only questioned her briefly about the arrangements for the festival. Miss Marple decided to pay her a visit. Margaret lived in a small cottage near the church, surrounded by a tidy garden filled with late autumn flowers. When Miss Marple arrived, Margaret welcomed her politely and offered tea. The two women sat in the quiet sitting room, where the afternoon sunlight filtered softly through the curtains. For several minutes they spoke about the festival and the shock that had followed Arthur Bellamy's death. Margaret seemed saddened by the entire situation, but Miss Marple noticed a certain tension in her voice whenever Arthur's name was mentioned. Finally, Miss Marple asked a simple question. Had Margaret known Arthur Bellamy before he arrived in St. Mary Mead? Margaret froze for a moment. The hesitation was brief, but it was enough. Miss Marple's gentle eyes remained steady as she waited for the answer. Margaret slowly set down her teacup. Then she admitted something that changed everything. Yes, she had known Arthur Bellamy before. But in those days, he had used a different name. Many years earlier, Margaret's younger brother had owned a small farm in another county. He had been an honest man who worked hard to keep the farm running. At that time, a man named Charles Benton had approached him with a financial proposal that sounded very similar to the agreements Arthur Bellamy had recently offered to the farmers of St. Mary Mead. Margaret's brother had trusted him. He signed the documents. Within a year, the farm had been taken from him through a series of complicated legal claims buried inside the agreement. The man called Charles Benton had quietly gained control of the property. Margaret's brother lost everything. The loss destroyed him financially and emotionally. Not long after, he died. Margaret had never forgotten the man responsible. And when Arthur Bellamy arrived in St. Mary Mead, she recognized him almost immediately. He had changed his name. But he had not changed his methods. Margaret watched quietly as Arthur began approaching the farmers of the village with the same kind of financial arrangements that had ruined her brother's life years earlier. At first she said nothing. But when she overheard Leonard Griggs arguing with Arthur during the harvest festival, Margaret realized that Arthur's scheme was about to succeed again. More farmers might lose their land. More families could suffer the same fate as her brother. Margaret knew the truth. And she believed that Arthur Bellamy would never stop hurting people. So she made a decision. Earlier that evening, while preparing the drinks for the festival, Margaret had taken a small bottle of poison that she kept for killing pests in the garden. When she carried the glass of cider to the stage and placed it beside the podium, she quietly added the poison to the drink. Arthur Bellamy never suspected anything. Margaret's voice remained calm as she finished telling the story. She had not acted out of sudden anger, she explained. She had acted because she believed Arthur Bellamy would continue ruining lives unless someone stopped him. Miss Marple listened carefully. She understood Margaret's pain. But she also understood that the law could not ignore what had happened. Later that evening, the police were informed of Margaret's confession. The mystery of the harvest festival had finally been solved. Arthur Bellamy had not been the generous man the village believed him to be. He had been a careful manipulator who moved from place to place, gaining trust and exploiting people for financial gain. Margaret Hill had recognized him. And she had decided to end his schemes permanently. In the days that followed, the villagers of St. Mary Mead struggled to accept the truth. The harvest festival, once a symbol of unity and celebration, had become a reminder that even the quietest places could hide dark secrets. Miss Marple returned to her usual routine soon after the case was resolved. As always, she believed that human nature remained remarkably consistent no matter where one lived. Greed, deception, loyalty, and revenge could appear in any village, even one as peaceful as St. Mary Mead. The Harvest Festival mystery had proven that once again. And if you enjoy mysteries where quiet villages hide dangerous secrets, where careful observation reveals the truth behind deception, and where every small clue matters, then make sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel for more Miss Marple mysteries just like this one. Because in stories like these, the smallest detail can uncover the biggest secret.